Hello, I'm Sudipto Mondal and welcome to Reflections on What's Your Ism. I've started this reflection segment to create some breathing space between episodes, to hold on to an idea for a little longer before I move to the next topic. Like provide footnotes, references, share further reading. So for this episode, I'm trying to look back at the conversation I had with the author Anand Neelakantan. Now you might remember, during the interview, I kept using adjectives to describe Anand's work, saying it is provocative, it is powerful. What I actually wanted to do is to read excerpts from his books and discuss them with Anand. But the conversations just kept darting off in different directions and I couldn't find my way back to the excerpts. So stay with me as I read one of my favorite sections from Anand's books. Oh, and before I forget, I want to remind you that you can listen to What's Your Ism on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. I imagine you listening to this show while you're traveling, breaking from work, doing things around the house, taking a walk. Not sitting in front of a screen, there isn't much to see here. So the excerpt I'm going to read is from a section in the book called Asura, where Ravana has just conquered Ayodhya and defeated the king Anaranya. The scene is that the king of Ayodhya refuses to bow to Ravana, who has vanquished him, and instead the king questions his caste, saying, "I will not bow to a Shudra." In response, Ravana says, "I am not a Shudra, my father is a Brahmin." The defeated king mocks his claim and reminds Ravana that his mother was an Asura and his father had disowned him. Ravana is full of regret for claiming a high caste status just to get some respect from a man he had defeated. And so, he goes into this monologue. Stay with me. "I left the dilapidated palace for my army to plunder. There wasn't much to plunder except the old temple in the palace. While his subjects died of hunger, their king was decorating his god with rubies and diamonds. And the rascal had the nerve to say that my touch would pollute him. But then, why did I try to seek his approval by saying that my father was a Brahmin? I wanted to kick myself for that. What did that mean? Was there a racist devil lurking inside me? Or was I uncomfortable with my Asura identity? Prahasta might have said it was because I still yearned for my father's love. I hated my father and all that he represented. I hated the Brahmins, the Devas, and their culture, or the lack of it. I hoped no one had heard me. I was their leader. These poor Asuras had left their homes, their wives, children, and old parents to follow me in my quest for glory. And what did I give them in return? I ought to have been ashamed of myself. Never again would I consider myself a Brahmin. I hated my fair skin. I hated my height. I was an Asura, the proud inheritor of Mahabali, Hiranya Yaksha, and the scores of mighty emperors who had shaped Indian civilization. Ravana then goes on to describe Ayodhya as a place where people do not care about open defecation or spitting on the road, but are careful not to be polluted by somebody's touch. He says, "Another strange thing I noticed was that there were fewer women than men on the streets, and they were veiled and did not look at the men in the eye. They walked with their eyes fixed on their dusty feet. I had never seen such submissive women in my life." This was a different culture, an exotic civilization which was centuries behind anything I had seen in my kingdom of the Asura, Vanara, Yaksha, or Nagas. Our army marched out of Ayodhya and I promptly forgot the name along with the other North Indian dustbins our army had marched through. Later, much later, a prince from this miserable place would turn my world upside down. Perhaps, had I followed Prahasta's advice and hunted down the royal family and finished them off, things would have been different. Maybe our race would have been saved. Our country retrieved from the clutches of a religion which discriminated against its own people. I was quite sure this darkness from the north would spread over my beloved country, splitting people not by language or race or affluence, but by the subjective views of a set of Brahmins who decided what was pure and what was impure. Powerful. Provocative? Sure. Does Anand's writing have literary value? Of course. But is his work original? Not at all. In fact, Anand says that these anti-caste counter-narratives have existed for thousands of years. He has just brought them back to life. So what attracted him to these counter-narratives? Where does his passion for this kind of biting criticism come from? What is the source of Anand Neelakantan's rage? Anand is the first to admit to his privilege and say that his rage against the caste system does not come from the lived experience of having been oppressed because of caste. But because Anand engages so deeply with the caste question in all his works, I can't help but reflect on his work through my reading of other anti-caste thinkers who have had a lived experience of caste. The most prominent of them is, of course, Ambedkar. Now, Anand says that he can appreciate the brilliance of Ambedkar but identifies more with Charvaka, the militant Brahmin scholar who challenged the divinity of the Vedas. I found it interesting that he would invoke the Charvaka tradition because of how widely Ambedkar has referenced Charvaka in his two most significant books on the caste system, Riddles in Hinduism and Revolution and Counter-Revolution. Much of Ambedkar's critique of Brahminism is based not just on the writings of Charvaka, but also Brihaspati. He also goes into the critiques of the Vedas in the Upanishads and the Vedantic school of thought. Ambedkar, in fact, applauds the critique of Brahminism that emerged from within the Brahminical intellectual ecosystem in the form of Vedanta or the Charvakas or the Upanishads. But he also refuses to engage any further with the debates within the various Brahminical schools. Ambedkar instead chose Buddhism. In Riddles in Hinduism, Ambedkar says, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says that the Vedic Brahmins despise the Upanishads and the Vedanta but still manage to accommodate these schools. He says one of the abiding riddles about Hinduism is how it manages to retain its essential caste character despite accommodations. Nothing changes. The debates between the various Brahmin schools never involve the common people. And that's why Ambedkar argued that it is better to leave the religion than try and reform it. Anand Neelakantan, on the other hand, disapproves of conversions as a path out of the caste system. About the Abrahamic religions, he makes only a passing critique by pointing to the plight of Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims. But surely, there is more to the story of the emergence of Christianity and Islam in caste-ridden South Asia. After all, these are the two religions that spread by distributing a holy book to those who were banned from reading. I hope there'll be another chance to discuss this with Anand. Now, Anand Neelakantan also critiques Buddhism in my interview with him. But again, it's an area I could have explored further with him, but could not. Looking back, I would have really have liked to hear his views on Navayana Buddhism started by Ambedkar. Anand's central argument is that the oppressed castes should fight the battle of narratives. By converting to another religion, they abandon this battlefield. He says that Brahminism is a set of stories and rituals that can be contested with another set of stories and rituals. The route to emancipation is through this storytelling contest. It doesn't matter what anybody thinks about this as a strategy for emancipation, because it is a choice that millions of Dalits and other lower castes have already made. The fact on the ground is that an overwhelming majority of them continue to identify as Hindu. Anand argues that the lower castes participate in Hindu society by retaining their rebellious streak. Their histories are meshed with the retellings of epics such as the Mahabharata and Ramayana. Their lived experiences are reflected in their arguments against Brahmanism. There is no chanting in Sanskrit. Their rituals involve offerings of meat and blood. Again, whether this is the route to emancipation from caste oppression can be debated. But Anand's arguments and his large body of work offer some clues to understand the spiritual choices of the millions of lower caste people who live outside the influence of Navayana Buddhism, outside the influence of Christianity, Islam, or the other radical anti-caste ideologies. I am willing to go as far as to say that it will be hasty to dismiss them as willing victims. Now, I also briefly want to reflect on another topic that I discussed with Anand, which was to do with the intermediary or the middle castes or the Shudras. But I'm afraid I might be running out of time a little over here. You could, of course, go further into this subject. I have 2 reading recommendations for you. The first is a book by Ambedkar titled Who Were the Shudras and How They Came to Be the 4th Varna in the Indo-Aryan Society. Read that book to understand how the Shudras, who were one of the Aryan Kshatriya communities of the solar race, became socially degraded. The second book is Caste in Bengal, edited by Shekhar Bandopadhyay and Tanika Sarkar. In this book, there's an essay titled Bhadralok and Their Dals, Politics of Social Factions in Calcutta between 1830 and 1856. There's an interesting story in this essay about a family from the shepherd caste who bribe a Brahmin to be granted the status of Kayastha Bhadralok. This essay connects back to the stories Anand shared during the interview about the Travancore kings and the Nambudris, Chandragupta Maurya, the shepherd king, and his prime minister, Kautilya or Chanakya. These stories illustrate the fluidity between the Shudra and the Kshatriya identities. Take for instance Chandragupta Maurya, who was elevated to the status of a Kshatriya. His rule was defined by the Brahminical influence of Chanakya's Arthashastra. But his grandson, Ashoka, discarded most of the Kautilyan codes of the Mauryan Empire and gravitated instead towards Buddhism. The shifting ideologies of intermediary communities continue to shape politics and society to this day. As Shudras, they have contested Brahmanism and suffered under it. And as Kshatriyas, they have cooperated with Brahmanism and benefited from it. The OBC category was created for the protection of those intermediary communities that have been oppressed by the caste system. But to this day, we have not been able to figure out in a way that is agreeable to everybody as to which one of these intermediary communities have been oppressed by the caste system. Independent India has never conducted a comprehensive study to measure the backwardness of the castes that have been added to the OBC list. Over the years, many powerful, land-owning, ruling castes have been added to the OBC list without any study to ascertain their alleged backwardness. Today, there is a resounding cry across the country for a census to figure out the social and economic status of all the castes in India. If conducted, it will show which communities have benefited the most from the caste system. It will also, for the first time, answer with qualitative and quantitative data who are the Shudras and to what extent have they been exploited by the caste system. I'll stop here, but I hope I offered some provocations for you to respond to. Write to me. My email ID is sudipto@thenewsminute.com. You could also show your appreciation by paying me for my work. You can do that by scanning this QR code. I'll see you in the next episode where I speak to Dr. Rais Muhammad and his conversion to Islam.